A single man prevented the end of the world, and almost no one knows his name. In the summer of 1985, a Soviet colonel sat alone in a Moscow apartment, waiting for the knock that meant death. For years he had lived two lives, one as the KGB's most trusted officer in London, the other as Britain's greatest spy inside the Soviet Union. He knew the truth about both sides, that fear, not hatred, was driving the Cold War toward nuclear war. And in a single act of defiance, he stopped it. This is not fiction, it happened. And his name was Oleg Gordievsky, the spy who saved the world. Moscow, October 1938. The city hums with a strange, exhausted pride. Factories roar, trains whistle through the fog, and posters of Stalin's face stare down from every corner. In a narrow apartment on Leningradsky Prospect, a child is born to a man who serves the state and a woman who fears it. His name is Oleg Antonovich Gordievsky. His father, Anton Gordievsky, is a loyal officer of the NKVD, the secret police that enforces Stalin's will. He's a quiet man who believes discipline is the highest virtue. In their apartment building, everyone works for the state: policemen, informants, administrators. Every wall carries whispers, every neighbor watches the other. For the Gordievskys, this is normal life. Loyalty is oxygen. From his earliest memories, Oleg breathes the language of secrecy. His father never tells stories from work, but sometimes the boy sees the tension behind his calm face, nights when he comes home late, smelling of tobacco and rain, locking the door behind him twice. The next morning, a neighbor might be gone. No one speaks of it. The party protects the people, his father tells him. We must protect the party. Oleg nods, too young to question, already learning silence. As the Second World War breaks out, Moscow becomes a fortress. Bombers drone overhead. Food is rationed. The city's children are trained to hide in basements when the sirens wail. Oleg is 6 when his mother takes him to the countryside for safety. There, in quiet fields, he first hears foreign radio, crackling voices speaking languages he doesn't understand. Something about that sound stays with him, the idea that there are worlds beyond the one he's been taught to trust. When the war ends, the Soviet Union stands triumphant, scarred but victorious. Stalin's portrait hangs beside Lenin in every classroom. The nation rebuilds brick by brick under a climate of suspicion. Every victory, every failure, every death explained through ideology. The world is divided, the just and the corrupt, the socialist and the capitalist, the Soviet and the Western. Young Oleg accepts it as truth. He's a disciplined student, sharp, observant, methodical. Teachers describe him as precise with words, careful with emotions. He shows early talent for languages. German comes easily, he studies it obsessively. The post-war world fascinates him, especially Europe, the geography, the music, the way entire nations seem to live differently. He never says so aloud, but he feels a quiet pull toward that other world. At the State Institute of International Relations, MGIMO, he enters a different sphere, the training ground of Soviet diplomats and intelligence officers. It's 1955 and Khrushchev is in power. The atmosphere is less suffocating than Stalin's era but still heavy with control. Students here are the elite, sons and daughters of trusted party families. They will become ambassadors, trade envoys, spies. Oleg fits perfectly. Loyal father, clean background, high discipline, linguistic talent. He masters Danish and Swedish, studies European history, memorizes political structures. His classmates are ambitious, but Oleg stands apart, reserved, serious, the kind who observes before speaking. He plays chess, runs track, and reads Dostoevsky and Dickens with equal interest. His mind is both Soviet and quietly curious about what lies beyond Soviet walls. Recruiters from the KGB visit the institute regularly. They don't advertise themselves, but everyone knows who they are. They look for 3 things: family reliability, emotional restraint, and intellectual precision. Oleg has all 3. In 1962, just after graduating, he is invited for civil service. The euphemism means one thing: KGB. At 24, he becomes an officer in the organization once known as his father's NKVD, the sword and shield of the state. He doesn't question it. For a man of his generation, this is the highest honor. His father beams with pride. His mother remains silent. Training begins in a compound outside Moscow. The young officers study counterintelligence, political theory, interrogation psychology, surveillance techniques. They learn to tail suspects, to read invisible messages in letters, to disassemble Western radios, to memorize faces from photographs. Above all, they learn obedience. A KGB officer, one instructor says, is not a man. He is an instrument. The party thinks. You act. Oleg excels. He's quick, calm, and analytical. He never brags, never complains. He understands that in the KGB, invisibility is power. The louder you are, the shorter your career. In 1963, he receives his first foreign posting, East Berlin, the front line of the Cold War. Berlin is still a scar divided by ideology. To the east, Soviet tanks patrol wide boulevards. To the west, neon signs and American cars gleam across the border. The difference is blinding. For a young officer raised in Soviet gray, the western half looks impossibly alive. He studies it through binoculars from his office window, advertisements, crowds, the easy laughter of people not afraid to be seen. He tells himself it's propaganda, that Western freedom is just chaos disguised as happiness. But one morning in August 1961, he wakes to the sound of trucks and shouting. Soviet and East German soldiers are sealing the city with barbed wire and concrete. The Berlin Wall is born. Oleg watches as families scream across the barrier. Some try to climb it. Some are shot. A man in a business suit lies bleeding in the street as a West German ambulance waits helplessly on the other side. Oleg stands in uniform, powerless, pretending not to feel the nausea in his gut. The official reports call it a triumph, a necessary defense against capitalist subversion. But to him, it looks like imprisonment on a national scale. That image will never leave him. He returns to Moscow changed, outwardly loyal, inwardly uncertain. He continues his work, reading Western journals for intelligence analysis, though he's now reading for understanding. He keeps his doubts hidden. Within the KGB, doubt is a disease. One careless word can mean dismissal or worse. In 1966, he's posted again, this time to Copenhagen under diplomatic cover. The Danish capital is different from everything he's known. Clean, open, unafraid. People smile at strangers, read foreign newspapers, discuss politics in cafes. To a Soviet officer, this freedom is intoxicating and dangerous. He's supposed to collect political gossip, track Soviet defectors, and monitor Danish journalists who criticize Moscow. But his reports grow thinner. Instead, he spends evenings walking along the Nyhavn Canal, listening to jazz, watching people simply exist without fear. Then in August 1968, Soviet tanks roll into Czechoslovakia. The Prague Spring, the movement that promised socialism with a human face, is crushed in a week. Oleg listens to Western radio describe civilians waving flags, students blocking tanks with their bodies, soldiers firing into crowds. The next morning, Soviet newspapers call it a victory against counter-revolution. For Oleg, something breaks. He realizes the propaganda isn't protecting truth, it's strangling it. The same ideals his father worshipped have become weapons against their own people. He writes a report for Moscow, mechanically defending the invasion. But when he mails it, his hands shake. From then on, his work becomes a performance. In meetings, he recites party lines flawlessly. In private, he reads banned books, smuggled in by Western acquaintances, Huxley, Orwell, Koestler. He's astonished how precisely they describe the world he lives in. Still, he never imagines betraying his country. To him, Russia and the Soviet system are different things. He loves the first deeply, distrusts the second completely. But history rarely allows such distinction. In 1970, he returns home and marries Yelena, a fellow diplomat. The marriage is distant, formal, more alliance than affection. The KGB prefers stable family men. Emotion is vulnerability. They're posted again to Copenhagen in 1972, now with higher rank and more access. Oleg's job is to cultivate informants, build influence, and report on NATO discussions. By now, he's fluent in the subtle language of espionage. Meetings at embassies, coded phrases, surveillance checks. But he also sees the weakness in the Soviet system, the corruption, the paranoia, the emptiness of ideology. The contrast between what Moscow demands and what the world truly looks like grows unbearable. He begins sending signals, small, careful gestures that only professionals would notice. A book placed on a certain cafe table, a phrase used twice in a conversation with a Danish contact. The British notice. One cold evening in late 1974, a man sits beside him in a quiet Copenhagen restaurant. He's polite, middle-aged, unremarkable. He asks about Russian literature, then about politics. After an hour, he slides a matchbox across the table. Inside is a slip of paper. "You can trust us. We can trust you." Oleg stares at it for a long moment before closing the box. He understands the magnitude of the step before him. To the KGB, treason is death. But to him, loyalty has already lost its meaning. Over the next months, he meets his MI6 contact discreetly, often in crowded cafes or during diplomatic events. He sets his terms. No money, no personal betrayal, no unnecessary harm. He will share information not for gain, but to balance truth against lies. MI6 agrees. They call him Sunbeam, a name chosen to reflect clarity in darkness. By the end of 1975, his first reports reach London. They're extraordinary, detailed analyses of Soviet foreign operations, profiles of officers, and the KGB's perception of Western governments. MI6 realizes what they have, not just a mole, but a thinker inside the Kremlin's mirror world. For Oleg, the transformation is spiritual as much as political. He's no longer working for the state but for humanity. He tells no one, not his wife, not his colleagues, not even his conscience too loudly. The fewer words spoken, the longer he might live. Back in Moscow, his father falls ill and dies, a loyal servant of the system to the end. Oleg attends the funeral quietly, knowing the old man would never understand his son's double life. He salutes the coffin of a man who served out of faith, while he himself now serves out of truth. In 1978, his cover is rotated again. The KGB reassigns him to headquarters temporarily. For the first time in years, he cannot pass intelligence. He's watched more closely, confined to desk work. But patience is part of survival. He keeps his head low and waits. Then a new opportunity arises: London. The KGB's London residency needs officers with language skill and diplomatic experience. Oleg fits both perfectly. He applies, carefully supported by allies inside the bureaucracy. His request is approved. In 1982, 2 decades after joining the KGB, he returns to the city that will become both his stage and his battlefield. He boards the Aeroflot flight with a calm face and a storm inside. Behind him lie 20 years of indoctrination. Ahead lies the tightrope of history. London, 1982. The city hums beneath a low gray sky. Double-decker buses rumble through Kensington. The smell of diesel, rain, and coffee fills the air. For Oleg Gordievsky, this is more than a foreign posting. It's a return to the stage of his second life. He arrives under diplomatic cover, officially as a counselor at the Soviet embassy. His real assignment is with the KGB's London residency, responsible for political intelligence and influence operations. For the British, his arrival is nothing short of a miracle. Their most valuable source has returned, now with greater rank and access than ever before. The MI6 team that manages him operates with almost surgical precision. There are no meetings in secret apartments, no dead drops under park benches. Gordievsky's contact is a calm, soft-spoken officer named Dickie Franks, later head of the Secret Intelligence Service. Their relationship is professional, but laced with quiet admiration. MI6 understands they're dealing not with a mercenary, but with a man driven by conviction. In the heart of London, Gordievsky now inhabits two realities. By day, he sits behind a heavy wooden desk, reading reports, planning operations, and attending embassy receptions. He mingles with British politicians, journalists, and academics, some friendly to Moscow, others under subtle pressure. By night, he returns to his small flat, closes the curtains, and transforms into Britain's invisible ally. He memorizes names, details, meeting points, and policy briefings, translating them mentally before transferring them to the British in tightly coded signals. He never writes anything down. Every transfer of information happens through a rhythm of gestures, timing, and routine. It's a ballet of espionage, every step rehearsed, every glance significant. His intelligence is gold. He reveals the KGB's operational structure in Western Europe, identifies deep-cover agents, and outlines Soviet priorities. But his greatest gift isn't the documents, it's perspective. He explains the psychology of the Soviet leadership, their paranoia, their fear of Western deceit, their obsession with secrecy. Through him, MI6 learns that the Kremlin doesn't see itself as a predator, but as prey. The Politburo truly believes the United States is preparing for a nuclear-first strike. This insight changes how Western leaders interpret every Soviet move. The Cold War, they realize, is not just about power, it's about fear. In Downing Street, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher listens closely. She meets with MI6 officers who brief her on the information coming from a uniquely placed source. She never learns his name, but she feels his impact. The data Gordievsky provides during the early 1980s shapes British strategy at a critical moment, when NATO missiles are being stationed in Europe and Soviet rhetoric reaches fever pitch. Gordievsky continues to rise. In just 3 years, he becomes deputy resident, effectively the number 2 in the KGB's London operations. He is now the gatekeeper of Soviet intelligence in Britain, approving reports, managing agents, and advising Moscow on political trends. The KGB trusts him completely. They call him the most westernized officer in the service, meant as both praise and suspicion. Inside, he feels the weight of his double life pressing down. Every phone call, every unexpected knock, every diplomatic invitation carries risk. He drinks sparingly, avoids personal friendships, and trains himself to speak evenly even under stress. He knows the KGB often tests its own officers, sending colleagues to provoke confessions or slips. Still, there are moments of quiet pride. He watches television coverage of NATO summits and smiles faintly, knowing decisions are being influenced by intelligence he provided. He reads speeches from Reagan and Thatcher, understanding how subtle shifts in tone, the decision to de-escalate rhetoric, to open dialogue, stem from his warnings about Soviet paranoia. He is shaping history from the shadows. But by 1985, shadows begin to close around him. Across the Atlantic, in a quiet Virginia suburb, another man is fighting different demons. Aldrich Ames, a senior CIA counterintelligence officer, sits at his kitchen table surrounded by bills. His marriage is failing, his finances collapsing. The glamour of espionage has dissolved into bureaucracy and debt. His new wife, Maria, wants the luxury her husband's salary can't buy. Ames decides to fix his problems the easy way, by selling secrets. On May 15, 1985, he walks into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offers the KGB a list of Western assets operating in the Soviet Union. The deal is simple: $50,000 for the first batch, more for future cooperation. The KGB accepts instantly. Ames leaves that night with a pocket full of cash and a death sentence for dozens of spies. Within weeks, Soviet counterintelligence begins quietly cross-referencing the information. Some details are vague, some precise, but one fact stands out. Somewhere in London, a senior KGB officer has been leaking information of extraordinary value to the British. In early May, the center sends a telegram to the London residency. It's short, formal, and deadly in its subtext. Colonel Oleg Gordievsky is to return to Moscow immediately. Promotion and consultation. He receives it in his office. The words seem ordinary, but his stomach tightens. He's been in the game too long not to recognize a recall masked as reward. He telephones his superiors to confirm and receives polite but firm instructions. Fly out within 3 days. That evening he contacts MI6. The message is clear, they may suspect. Should I run? His handlers beg him to defect immediately. They can protect him. The British have contingency plans, safe houses, new identities, but Oleg hesitates. His wife Layla and their 2 daughters are in Moscow. If I disappear, he says, they'll be punished, maybe worse. He boards the Aeroflot flight from Heathrow on May 19, 1985. The weather is cold and gray, the same as when he arrived 3 years earlier. He watches the English coastline vanish beneath the clouds and whispers, "Goodbye, London." When he lands at Sheremetyevo Airport, the world feels different. The air is heavy with silence. His passport is stamped without expression, but he can sense eyes on him. 2 men in plain suits follow at a distance. At home, his apartment looks untouched until he notices the small details. A drawer slightly ajar, books misaligned, a photograph turned face down. The KGB has been there. Days pass without explanation. He reports to headquarters as ordered, submits routine paperwork, and waits. Then the summons arrives. Lubyanka, the heart of the KGB, the place where countless confessions were extracted. He dresses carefully, carries no notes, and kisses his wife goodbye. "Just a meeting," he says. She doesn't answer. In the interrogation room, 3 men sit across from him. One smiles. They offer him cognac Ararat, his favorite. He drinks slowly, knowing the ritual. Alcohol lowers defenses. Questions begin politely. "How was London? How are your colleagues? Did the British treat you well?" He answers smoothly. Then the tone shifts. "Colonel, have you ever had contact with Western intelligence?" He laughs. "Of course, at receptions, conferences, it's unavoidable." "Not socially," they reply, "professionally." The room grows colder. The cognac burns his throat. The questions become rhythmic, hypnotic, then accusatory. He realizes he's been drugged. His mind clouds. Hours pass. One general repeats the same phrase over and over, "Priznайся, confess." He says nothing. When it ends, they let him go. That's the most terrifying part. The KGB never releases a traitor. If they let him walk, it means they're watching, waiting for him to make a mistake to lead them to his handlers. At home, Oleg's instincts take over. He bolts his doors, pushes furniture against them, and sleeps in his clothes. Every sound becomes a threat. The radio crackle makes him flinch. Even his daughter's footsteps startle him. He knows what happens next: quiet surveillance followed by disappearance. Then he remembers something. The escape plan MI6 designed years earlier for this exact nightmare. Operation Pimlico. The instructions are hidden inside 2 books of Shakespeare's sonnets, written in invisible ink. He retrieves them from his shelf, soaks the pages in water, and under the candlelight the words emerge. Travel north. Wait by the road at 2:20 a.m. Look for the British car with diplomatic plates. He memorizes every line, then burns the pages in a metal tray. The smoke smells of paper and fear. For the next week he prepares. He tells his wife he's being sent on a short trip to Leningrad. She nods without speaking. Maybe she knows the truth. Maybe she doesn't want to. Tuesday, 7 p.m. He walks through a crowded Moscow street holding a Safeway plastic bag, an object no Soviet citizen could easily acquire. That's the signal. If MI6 agents see him, they'll pass nearby carrying a Harrods bag, eating a Mars bar. A coded sign. Message received. The first Tuesday, nothing. He waits in the cold for hours, pretending to window shop. The second Tuesday, as twilight falls, a man in a suit passes by, Harrod's bag in one hand, chocolate bar in the other. For a moment their eyes meet. No words, just understanding. They will come for him. On Sunday morning, he leaves his apartment early. He boards a train to Leningrad, blending with commuters. He feels the weight of surveillance like static in the air. On the train, 3 men occupy nearby seats, silent, identical haircuts, identical expressions. He doesn't need to guess who they are. In Leningrad, he transfers to a bus heading north toward Vyborg near the Finnish border. The landscape outside turns rural birch forests, empty roads, gray skis. Halfway through the journey, he stands up and clutches his stomach. "I'm sick," he tells the driver. "Need to step out." The driver hesitates, then stops. The bus pulls over. Oleg steps into the forest and disappears. He runs through the trees, heart pounding. Branches tear his face, mud clings to his shoes. He finds the designated spot, a curve in the road near a large rock. He crouches behind it, breathing hard. Hours pass. The mosquitoes are relentless. He's bleeding from a cut on his temple, but he waits. At 2:20 a.m., headlights appear. 2 cars approach, the first carrying British diplomats, the second their security escort. For exactly 1 minute, they'll be hidden from the KGB car following behind. Oleg bursts from the trees. The trunk of the lead car pops open. He dives inside, curls into a ball, and the lid slams shut. Inside the darkness, he can barely breathe. Every bump feels like pursuit. Then he hears it, the long rumble of a freight train. The cars stop for the crossing. The KGB vehicle is trapped behind them. When the train clears, the British are gone. At the Finnish border, guards wave the diplomatic convoy through without inspection. The engine hums softly. Then faintly, Oleg hears music, the opening notes of Sibelius's Finlandia, the prearranged signal. They've crossed into Finland. He's safe. The trunk opens. A young MI6 officer helps him out. His face is pale, eyes hollow, but his voice is steady. "The luggage," the officer says into a secure phone, "has arrived and it's all in order." After 11 years of risking his life for the West, Oleg Gordievsky is free. When the trunk opened and the cold Finnish air hit his face, Oleg Gordievsky knew he was reborn. It was 2:30 in the morning. His body ached, his throat burned, and his head throbbed from exhaustion, but he was alive and free in a world that had just declared him dead. The British officers handed him a blanket, then quietly drove toward Helsinki. They stopped at a safe house on the outskirts of the city. A doctor examined him while an MI6 officer made a single phone call to London. "Sunbeam is home," he said. 2 words that rippled through the British intelligence community like a thunderclap. Within hours, the operation reached Downing Street. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was briefed personally. She had long known about the anonymous Soviet source who provided extraordinary insights into Kremlin thinking, but now she learned his name. She called him a brave and remarkable man. Her government authorized asylum, protection, and citizenship. Oleg was brought to Britain under a new identity, hidden from the world he had just escaped. For MI6, the escape was an operational masterpiece. In a century of espionage, few extractions were so daring, so flawlessly executed. The British called it the miracle of Pimlico, though the official record would never mention it. In Moscow, chaos followed. When the KGB realized he was gone, rage swept through its corridors. Oleg was declared a traitor, stripped of rank, and sentenced to death in absentia. His photograph was removed from files and walls. His name became a curse within the service. Layla, his wife, was taken for interrogation. For days she was questioned, threatened, and confined. She had known nothing, which only enraged them further. Their 2 young daughters were watched day and night. For the KGB, this was personal humiliation. They had been deceived by one of their own, a man who had sat in their meetings, shared their vodka, and stolen their secrets. Meanwhile, in Britain, Oleg's new life began in silence. He was given a house under government supervision, a new passport, and a name that would never appear in public records. MI6 officers rotated weekly to check on him. For months, he barely left home. He spent his days writing reports, debriefing MI6 and the CIA. The debriefings were exhaustive. Every memory mattered, every face, document, conversation, rumor. The CIA sent analysts to London to join the sessions. Over several weeks, they built the most complete psychological map of the Soviet intelligence apparatus ever created. But more valuable than the data were the insights. Gordievsky explained the Soviet worldview, not the slogans, but the fear. He described leaders surrounded by yes-men, paralyzed by paranoia, convinced the West was preparing to annihilate them. He told his Western counterparts something shocking. They truly believe a nuclear strike could come any day, not because you want war, but because they think you might miscalculate. His warnings reframed Western strategy. To the CIA and MI6, the Soviet threat now looked less like aggression and more like panic, an empire lashing out because it feared its own weakness. Back in 1983, 2 years before his escape, Oleg had already proven this point in the most dramatic way. That autumn, NATO had launched a large-scale exercise called Able Archer 83. It was designed to simulate the process of escalating from conventional warfare to nuclear release. There were briefings, coded transmissions, and even mock orders to test readiness. To Western militaries, it was routine, another drill in an endless game of preparation. But in Moscow, it was interpreted as something far darker. The KGB had long been running a project known as Operation Aryan, a vast intelligence program ordered by Yuri Andropov to detect signs of an impending Western nuclear first strike. Soviet analysts monitored everything: troop movements, satellite launches, even blood donations in Western Europe, searching for indicators of war. When Able Archer began in November 1983, the indicators lit up like a Christmas tree. Communications were encrypted differently. NATO leaders were participating personally. Warhead readiness levels were simulated in real time. From the Soviet perspective, this didn't look like an exercise. It looked like the beginning of the end. Oleg, stationed in London, watched the tension unfold from inside. His colleagues in the KGB residency received frantic cables from Moscow demanding updates. Soviet military units went on high alert across Eastern Europe. Strategic bombers were fueled and armed. Missiles in East Germany and Poland were moved to combat positions. The world teetered on the brink of nuclear exchange, and almost no one in the West realized it. Oleg knew the danger immediately. He reported to MI6 that Moscow's fear was genuine, not propaganda. The West was unknowingly simulating exactly what the Kremlin most feared: a surprise attack disguised as a drill. MI6 relayed his warning to Washington. The report reached President Ronald Reagan himself. Reagan was stunned. He wrote later in his diary, "I don't see how they could believe that, but it's something to think about." For the first time, the U.S. president understood that nuclear war could start not by aggression, but by mistake. That realization changed everything. Reagan softened his rhetoric, began to emphasize peace through understanding rather than intimidation. Over time, it opened the path toward dialogue with the Soviet Union, a path that would culminate in arms reduction treaties, and eventually, the end of the Cold War. Gordievsky's intelligence had not just informed strategy, it had altered the psychology of world leaders. It made them see the enemy not as monsters, but as terrified men clinging to power. After his debriefings, Oleg began to rebuild a quiet life. MI6 provided modest financial support, but he refused luxury. He lived simply, rented a house in a quiet English suburb, and started writing. His first book, Next Stop Execution, told his story in measured detail. It became a sensation among intelligence historians. He wrote not to boast, but to preserve truth, a record of how ideology distorts morality until truth itself becomes treason. Despite the book, his location remained confidential. He received occasional visits from journalists and academics, always under supervision. He met Margaret Thatcher privately. She thanked him personally, calling him a man of courage and conscience. Later, he met Ronald Reagan, who credited his reports for reshaping U.S. foreign policy. But freedom carried its own prison. His family remained in the Soviet Union, hostages to his choices. For years, he wrote letters through intermediaries, pleading for their release. Each was returned unopened or ignored. Finally, after relentless diplomatic pressure, his wife Layla and daughters were allowed to emigrate to Britain in 1991, 3 months before the Soviet Union collapsed. Their reunion was bittersweet. The children had grown up believing their father was a traitor. Layla carried the scars of interrogation and exile. She had loved him once but could not forgive the double life that had destroyed their family. They lived together briefly, then separated. For Oleg, it was the price of conviction, freedom purchased with loneliness. The 1990s brought him international recognition. He became an advisor to Western governments, a lecturer, and a consultant on intelligence reform. He received the Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George from Queen Elizabeth II, one of Britain's highest honors. The citation described him as a man whose service to the cause of liberty was beyond measure. Yet he never escaped danger. The KGB's successor, the FSB, did not forget. In 2007, British security services warned him of an assassination plot. Intelligence indicated that Russian operatives were planning to poison him, a method that would later become infamous. He was moved temporarily to a safe location. The attempt failed, but the threat never faded. Even in old age, he checked his locks twice and drank only sealed bottled water. Through it all, Oleg remained calm and analytical. When asked if he regretted his choices, he would answer softly, "I did what conscience demanded. That's not something you regret. It's something you endure." He lived to see his greatest prophecy fulfilled, the collapse of the Soviet Empire. From his quiet home in Britain, he watched the Berlin Wall fall, Eastern Europe break free, and Moscow renounce communism. To him, it was proof that the truth always erodes fear, slowly, relentlessly, inevitably. He also watched Russia's transformation with sadness. He saw former KGB men return to power, the machinery of control resurrected under new names. "The system," he once said, "did not die, it adapted." On March 4, 2025, Oleg Gordievsky died peacefully in his sleep at his home near London. He was 86 years old. No official ceremony was held, but in quiet offices across Europe and America, intelligence officers paused to honor him. Many of them owed their lives to the insights he provided decades earlier. Today, historians regard Gordievsky as one of the most significant intelligence sources of the 20th century, alongside Kim Philby, but standing at the opposite pole of morality. Philby betrayed Britain to the Soviets. Gordievsky betrayed the Soviets to save humanity from itself. His story also exposes a paradox at the heart of espionage, that truth and treason often wear the same face. Inside the KGB, he was branded a villain. In London, he was celebrated as a hero. The only difference was perspective. Yet what cannot be disputed is his impact. His intelligence changed how leaders saw the world and arguably prevented nuclear war. To understand his importance, one must see the Cold War as it truly was, not just a battle of armies, but a psychological standoff between two civilizations trapped by their own fear. Each believed the other capable of total destruction. The smallest miscommunication could end millions of lives. In that fragile balance, information, the correct understanding of the enemy's mind, was more powerful than any weapon. That was Gordievsky's contribution. He gave the West that understanding at the risk of his own existence. Without him, miscalculation might have triggered catastrophe. His courage demonstrated that even one man, armed only with truth, could alter the trajectory of history. And so, his legacy endures not in monuments or medals, but in the quiet fact that the world he helped save never knew how close it came to ending. The Cold War thawed, nuclear arsenals were reduced, and dialogue replaced paranoia. all shaped by the warnings of a man who lived in two shadows and served one light. He never saw himself as a hero. "Heroes are made by stories," he once said. "I was just a witness who could not stay silent." Yet when the history of the 20th century is written, when the moments that kept civilization alive are listed, his name stands among them. Oleg Gordievsky, born 1938, Moscow. KGB colonel, MI6 agent. The spy who saved the world.